This video is the perspective of an unlucky man captured by Tusken Raiders. Story by Koki Monster. Please enjoy.
I didn't expect my first trip across the Dune Sea to go like this. I just bought a small land speeder and loaded it up with supplies, thinking I'd make it across to Anchorhead in a day. The twin suns blazed overhead, turning the sand into a shining ocean of gold that stretched as far as the eye could see. I knew the desert was dangerous, with Tusken Raiders lurking about, but I figured if I kept to myself, I'd be fine. I was wrong. They came out of nowhere, a pack of them on those strange, grunting animals surrounding me before I could even pull out my blaster. I barely had a chance to shout before they were on me, rough hands dragging me from my speeder and tossing me to the ground. I felt a pain in the back of my head, then darkness. The next thing I knew, I was gagged, bound, and tossed over one of their beasts like a sack of sand. My protests were nothing but muffled sounds as they took me further into the desert, far from anyone who might be able to help. They had dragged me to their camp, a cluster of shabby tents surrounded by sharp rocks and piles of scrap. They pushed me into one of the tents and tied me to a wooden post. I could hear them grunting and chattering outside, their language like rough sand grating in my ears. Over the next few days, they'd come in, shove me around, take turns hitting me with sticks, and laugh like it was all a game. The ropes cut into my wrists and ankles, and my mouth was dry as dust. A man was kept in the same tent, but he seemed a ghost of himself. He was older, with deep wounds crisscrossing his body, and his eyes were empty, like they had seen too much pain to ever hope again. We would occasionally share glances, and though he never spoke, I could sense a shared understanding of our grim fate. I wondered how long he had been here. One night I was still awake, trying to forget the cuts and bruises that was inflicted on me, I listening to the sounds of the camp, when I heard a commotion outside. Voices shouted and the air was thick with tension. Suddenly, the flap of our tent was pulled open, and I felt a surge of panic. Two Tuskens stood there, dragging the man from his spot. His eyes widened in terror as they pulled him out, his body going limp as he fought against them. I tried to shout, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could do was watch, heart racing as they dragged him into the night. His screams pierced the air, raw and filled with desperation. "Help! Please!" he cried, but no one was coming. I hear the sounds of struggle, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, and then silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The screams had faded, and the camp fell eerily quiet again. I strained to hear any sign of him, but nothing came. I knew deep down whatever had happened to him was going to happen to me too. I was afraid but hopeless. Bonded to a wooden stick, I caught a glimpse of another tent. There was a woman who was also tied onto some wooden poles. She was kept at a distance from me, but I could hear her, hear the cries and groans of pain as the raiders torture her. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her face, bruised and tired. She looked like she'd been here a long time. Every sound she made tore at me, but there was nothing I could do. Every day I felt weaker, and every scream reminded me how hopeless this all was. More days passed, and I felt my hope slipping, leaving me with nothing but the raw feeling of survival. I was no hero. I was just a man in the wrong place, with no one to come for me. One night, as I sat in my corner of the tent, barely hanging on, I noticed a shadow moving in the darkness. It was a figure creeping around the edge of the camp, wrapped in a dark cloak. At first, I thought maybe it was another sand person, but then I noticed he moved differently, more cautious, more determined. He didn't have the slow, heavy pace of the raiders. He slipped behind a small building, hidden in the shadows. But before he disappeared, I caught a glimpse of his face. He looked young, worried, almost scared. I could only watch, bounded and helpless, as the boy disappeared behind one of the larger tents. Shortly after he ducked behind the tent, a faint blue glow bloomed in the darkness, casting eerie light over the ground. Strange, I've never seen that before. What was that? Whatever it was gone now. I sat there, helpless for what seems to be only a few seconds. Suddenly, the same boy exited the tent and stepped into view. As he stepped out, something was different. The look of worry had vanished from his face, replaced by something darker. His expression was fierce, his eyes hard and unrecognizable, like they were filled with pure anger. Before I could process it, he ignited a blazing blue weapon, a glowing blade humming with energy that seemed to come alive in his hand. Without a sound, he surged forward, the blade sweeping through the air. The first raider barely had time to turn his head before he was cut down. A shout went up from the others, but it was too late. The boy was already moving, flowing through the camp like a storm. His strikes were filled with anger, the blade carving a bright path through the dark, cleaving through leather, bone, and flesh with ease. 2 more raiders charged him, raising their gaffy sticks in defense. He blocked their blows effortlessly, the blue blade meeting wood and bone with a crackling hiss, deflecting every strike with inhuman speed. He spun his weapon, cutting through the raiders like they didn't even matter. Their bodies fell to the ground with a heavy thud, kicking up clouds of dust that settled around his feet. More Tuskens scrambled in panic, yelling to each other, but he was relentless, his expression cold and focused as he advanced through the camp. I watched as he reached one of the smaller tents. Without hesitation, he slashed it open, his face set in fury as he swept the blade inside. What I saw next was haunting. Inside the tent were women and children, Tuskens who weren't even a threat, but they were given no mercy. He struck them down with hatred in each swing. I huddled in my corner, too afraid to make a sound, wondering if he was my savior or if he would turn that blade on me next. I'd never seen anyone fight like that. It was ruthless, brutal, like he wasn't even human anymore. I held my breath, waiting, hoping he wouldn't notice me in the shadows. When he was done, he stood alone, surrounded by the still bodies of his enemies, breathing heavily as if the fight had cost him something he couldn't get back. He lowered his weapon, his shoulders slumping slightly, and the hard anger in his eyes faded, leaving only exhaustion and something else. Pain, maybe, or regret. He looked toward the small tent where I first saw him. Slowly, he went into the tent and, after a moment, came out carrying the body of the woman. She was gone. I watched as he carefully packed her onto a speeder, his movements suddenly gentle, almost tender. Then, without a glance back, he drove off, leaving me alone in the silence. I stumbled to my feet, looking around at the scene he'd left behind. The Sand People were gone. Every single one of them. For a second, I almost felt sorry for them, for what they'd suffered in those last moments. Whoever that boy was, he wasn't like anyone I've seen. Thinking more clearly now, the weapon he used. I've heard stories of similar weapons used by those known as Jedi, protector of peace. But that boy, he didn't look like a Jedi. They were supposed to be calm, peaceful, protectors. But this was something else entirely. I would never know who that boy was, or why he was filled with so much hatred. But as I turned away from the camp and set off across the sands, one thing was clear. Whatever happened here may have just created a monster more horrifying than the Sand People.